Now that you have a solid understanding of the tools and workflows for making corrections to the image as a whole, in this lesson we'll turn our attention to isolating our corrections to specific parts of the image. Perhaps you want to change the color of your subject's clothing, or add more light to her face to help focus the viewer's attention. In this lesson, you'll learn how to use Resolve's powerful HSL qualifier to perform those tasks. If you're following along, make sure you have the Salt Flats project open from the previous lesson. Then choose Lesson 19 from the Quick Access menu at the top of the viewer. The shot we'll be working on together is Shot 10. For this shot, we're going to perform a fairly common effect where we preserve one color while making the rest of the shot black and white. In the center toolbar, select the Qualifier palette. I've already given this shot a normalization correction to maximize the contrast and color balance of the image. With a node selected, press Option S to add a serial node. Move your cursor over the image. You should see the sample eyedropper. If you're not seeing this eyedropper, make sure it's selected in the menu in the lower left of the viewer. Click on a bright red pixel and the baseball cap. You won't see any immediate change in the viewer, but some stuff has happened in the qualifier palette below. The qualifier that is chosen by default is an HSL qualifier. HSL refers to the three components of color: hue, saturation, and luminance. The hue represents both the color and shade of color. So for example, the color can be red, but its shade can be a brick red or a fire engine red. The saturation is the amount of that color, and the luminance is the brightness of the color. When you select a color with the eyedropper, Resolve detects varying amounts of hue, saturation, and luminance in the sampled area, then places range graphics on the corresponding control bars for each color component. Looking at the hue, a very narrow range of hue was selected, whereas a wider range was selected for both saturation and luminance. But that doesn't help us very much. In order to actually see what was selected, click the highlight button in the upper left of the viewer. You're now seeing a representation of your selection against a gray background. Just like a green screen key, our selection is isolated from the rest of the image. To see a traditional view of the key, click the highlight button in the upper right. As you can see, the key is not very clean. Return to the highlight view by clicking the button to the left. One helpful way to determine which color component is having the most effect on the key is to disable it. For example, disabling luminance does not seem to be having much effect on the image at all. But if you disable saturation, it has a significant effect. We now see more red in the image because the hue range is so narrow that it's allowing other reds that share that hue to pass through. Now if you disable hue, the image is only showing you a range of saturation, irrespective of hue. We'll leave hue and saturation enabled. To expand the range of hue, drag outward on the range control until the width value is roughly 10.5. Move your pointer between the range handles, then drag to the left until the center value is 23.5. By moving the center point, the hue range now includes more magenta pixels. You can also add to your selection. Click the eyedropper with a plus, then click on the hat where there's very little red. Now we see more of the red hat. If you look at the range control for saturation, the range has widened to indicate that the selection has included less saturated pixels, which results in our subject's red headphones being added to the key. We can clean up the key further by using the matte finesse controls. In order to really see their effect on the image, click on the black and white highlight button. Adjust the clean white control to close up some of the holes in the selection you're trying to isolate. Then adjust the key black control to fill in the holes in the image you're attempting to omit. Use the blur radius to soften the edge of the key, and denoise to selectively soften and remove any stray areas that were missed by the qualifier. Now I know what you're about to ask. What about all these white areas in the lower part of the frame? We'll deal with that in a moment, but for now, turn off the highlight control. In the Primaries palette, drag the hue slider right or left to change the color of the hat. Only the areas within the qualified range are being affected. Because our key was not isolated to just the hat, you'll see spectators in the background with clothing in the same hue. We can address this with a window. Select the window palette, then select a circle shape. Move the window over the subject's head and adjust the size. With the window applied to the image, all areas outside the mask are excluded from the qualifier. And because the subject doesn't move, we don't need to track it. Okay, we started this exercise with the goal of creating that color on black and white background look. Reset the hue by double-clicking the name. we're going to use an outside node to create an inverted version of our qualifier. Right-click on Node 2 and choose Add Node, Add Outside. As with the previous nodes you've created, this node will send its image data via the green output into the green input triangle of the outside node. However, this time we see a dotted connection coming from the blue output on our qualifier node and connecting with the blue input triangle of the outside node. These outputs and inputs are for sending and receiving transparency information. In this case, the key data is being sent to the input, but it's kept isolated from the image data. So all we need to do to create our effect is to select node 3, then drop the saturation to 0. Let's play that back. Awesome. Now that you know how a qualifier works, let's look at a more practical example of how you might use it. Select shot 8. On one of the days Leslie was attempting her record-breaking speed run, it was cloudy with a chance of meatballs. Well, it was cloudy to be sure, and we're going to use a qualifier to bring more light and focus to her face. By now you should know that to achieve the best results from your secondary corrections, you should start with a good primary grade. Scrub to the middle of the clip until you can see the guy in the background with a white shirt. Select the white point picker and sample his shirt. Use the Lift Master wheel to crush the blacks to 0 on the scopes, then reduce the gain to retrieve the highlights that are lurking above the legal threshold for broadcast. Toggle the correction on and off. Shot's looking better already. Press Option S to create a serial node. Now go to the qualifier palette. Make sure the picker on the left is selected. You may still have the additive picker chosen from the previous exercise. Move the eyedropper over her face and click to create an HSL sample. Immediately, the color control bars go into action. Press Shift-H to enable the highlight mode. Use the additive eyedropper to widen the selection until you see most, if not all, of her face. In the Matte Finesse section, crank up the denoise, then adjust the clean black and clean white. Press Shift-H to turn off the matte. Her face is looking too red and saturated, but rather than making this assessment subjectively, let's look at a scope that will show us the color objectively. From the Scopes menu, choose Vector Scope. This scope has a circular layout compared to the other scopes we've been using so far. The Vector Scope's primary purpose is to show you the hue and saturation in your images. In other words, the color information only. These squares are color targets that represent all of the primary and secondary colors found on a color wheel. So going around the color wheel clockwise, you have magenta, blue, cyan, green, yellow, and red target boxes. These color boxes are exactly where you would expect to find them on the color wheels. Because the vector scope is only analyzing the facial pixels being output from node 2, we see these traces pointing toward the red target. How far these traces extend from the center reveals the level of saturation in the color. Notice as I drag on the saturation control, the traces move out from the center, and the image becomes highly saturated. If I go the other direction, the traces move toward the center and eventually become desaturated. If your color saturation ever goes beyond any of the target boxes, then your video will be considered illegal for broadcast. But where should her skin tones fall? Click the Settings button, then place a check next to Show Skin Tone Indicator. A white line appears at roughly 11 o'clock on the scopes. This is the line where skin tones should fall, regardless of race. Really, the only difference between us as humans is the amount of color saturation in our face. Group hug. So here we can clearly see that her face is really too red, and it wasn't just my imagination. Drag on the hue control until the color traces line up with the indicator. Then drop the saturation to about 37%. While we're here, let's brighten up her face by dragging on the Gain Master wheel. Let's play that back and have a look at the before and after. Wow, huge difference. Hopefully, after watching these lessons, you're catching a vision of just how critical color correction and grading can be to your story. In the next lesson, we'll look at a powerful new secondary color grading tool called the Color Warper.